First of all, thank you very much to Irina and Virginia for inviting me to do this commentary. So, what I'm going to do in those 20 minutes, and I hope it's going to be less than 20, I'm going to first do a discussion about the two different presentations. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about variation within bilinguals, and I'm going to present some of the data that we have. And then I'm going to have some recommendations for the way forward so that we can continue the discussion with everyone else. So Raymond talked about politics when he started his presentation, saying that there is a political dimension in the issue of bilingualism, and this has been there for a long time. We know that language and bilingualism is a political issue because it relates to minorities, it relates to dominance, it relates to control. And very often, bilingualism is interlinked with immigration, and there are politics behind immigration. So it's quite important when we're doing research on bilingualism to have that at the back of our minds, because the messages that we are giving out are going to a general audience, and they can be used by politicians and other people for their own purposes. And I'm giving you an example. This year in the UK, we have community languages or heritage languages part of the GCSE and A levels, and the government decided that some of them are not going to be part of the GCSE and A levels anymore. And one of the reasons is, the main reason is budget cuts. So we're going to cut something from the subjects. Let's cut the heritage languages. There is a dispute, and there are things that are disputed, others that are not disputed. So there is currently a dispute as to whether there are cognitive benefits of bilingualism, but I hope everyone in this room will agree that it's undisputed that there are some economic, social, cultural benefits from bilingualism. So bilinguals can communicate with a larger number of people. They can keep links with extended family, and culture and heritage can continue, and there is an economic benefit. People who are bilingual can work in different countries, and it's good for business, and there is a lot of different other reasons that I don't want to raise here. But it's very important to keep at the back of our minds that there are some things that are undisputed benefits of bilingualism. Now, Albert had those two models, and he discussed as to whether we have fully overlap or partially overlap. And then he presented several studies and concluded that the partially overlap model is better in terms of explaining the findings. I think the question that he raised as to whether there are common mechanisms between domain general executive functions and bilingual language control is slightly more complex, so I'm going to try to unpack this. So, does this question address the relationship between results from non-verbal and verbal executive control tasks? So, are we comparing the two, verbal and non-verbal, and we're going to see, is there overlap, is there inclusion? Or are we saying the relationship between results from non-verbal executive control tasks and language switching or language use behavior? Is that an inclusion? Is there an overlap? The third possibility is, are we talking about the relationship between domain general executive control and executive control related to language? So do we want to say that we have domain general and domain specific executive functions? And I think these are three different things. So if we are talking about the first two, and I think this, then it's an empirical question, and Albert presented some results where we have mixed. So some people have found positive effects, some people have found null effects. And so the conclusion, Albert's conclusion was that we have partial overlap. I think the most important question is actually point number 3, and I haven't seen very much of a discussion, and I think this is something that we need to take more seriously and think, are we talking about domain general and domain specific executive functions? To do that, we need conceptual, this is a conceptual and theoretical question. So the module so far has been that we have same executive functions and inhibiting control, which is used to suppress non-relevant language, and executive functions used generally to control attention and inhibition. So the way I understand the literature in terms of models is up until now, we've been operating with this inclusion model, testing whether that's true. Now, if we're going towards a partial overlap, then the logical continuation is that there must be some language-specific executive control mechanisms. So I'd like in the remaining of the, in the open discussion to have that discussed. Is that something which is desirable or not? And what are the implications if we're talking about a domain-specific executive function mechanism? But now before that discussion, I'm going to bring some issues that I think are bringing noise and variance in the data sets, and that's why some studies find null results. So there is a lot of variability in bilinguals, and the variability comes from different areas. So the first question is, who is bilingual? What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria in those studies? What is the type of bilingualism? And yesterday we heard from Harold's finding effects even for critical periods. What is the length of exposure? What is the proficiency in use? What is the type of exposure? Is that classroom or immersion? What are the language practices in use? We have issues of language dominance, and that changes also over time. And then there are other aspects that increase variance. So we have language proficiency, we have motivation, we have the socioeconomic status, and language typology, and many other reasons. So there is a lot of variance in the bilinguals, and I think what we need to do is, when we find null results, have a look, what was the variance? Who were those bilinguals? Or even better, design studies that can address all those factors. So there is very large individual variability, and we don't really understand very well how all those factors influence performance. So that requires further investigation. There's also a lot of variability in the executive function tasks and in the executive functions, and we heard about that yesterday. We heard issues about lack of reliability in some of the tasks, the complexity of the tasks, and also different people are using different tasks. Even slight variations in the task may show a different result. And we also heard yesterday that there's a lack of comprehensive models that integrate executive functions with language processing. And this is, I think, another area where we need to move a little bit forward with the models, even if Albert doesn't want to do that. So it's very likely that we have very little comparability between studies. I'm going to illustrate that by presenting two small data sets, one on code switching and one of bilingual education and literacy. Code switching because code switching is being discussed in the literature quite a lot in terms of executive functions, and the issue of bilingual education and literacy is not really being discussed very much. So I want to bring those two to your attention. So the one study is Julia Hofweber, one of my PhD students. She had a poster yesterday, so some of you may have already seen that, her study. So she's looking at bilinguals compared to monolinguals, and she's looking at code switching. There is a typology of code switching. So code switching is not just one thing. Different people code switch in different ways. So Moisken has made a classification for 3 types of code switching: alternation, where you use one language and then you switch to another language; insertion, where you have one language as a carrier and then you insert a word in; and then you also have the dense code switching, in which you have many more switches within the sentence, and also the grammatical morphology is also mixed into lexical items of the other language. And so we can hypothesize that switching, there is more switching if you do dense than if you do alternation. And maybe inhibition is the other way around. But what Julia wanted to see is if there are differences between the code switching. So if someone prefers dense, what are going to be the results in an executive function task? And also other preferences between individuals. So she had a group of German English and a group of two groups of German English bilinguals, and these are adults. And this group lives in South Africa, and it's sixth generation immigrants. Those live in the UK, they're first generation, and based on her criteria, the first group, they're simultaneous and balanced, the second group are sequential and dominant. And she did a range of tasks in terms of code switching. One of the tasks was a judgment task. So she was giving them sentences with code switching, and she was asking them, is this something that you do? Is this something that you hear in your environment? To get an idea of their preferences. Because it's very difficult, you know, if you ask them to read a narrative, there may be very few switches because of the artificiality of the context. And so what she found was that there was a difference between South African and UK bilinguals only in one of the categories, and that was the dense. So the ones in South Africa who are sixth generation and are balanced and simultaneous use more dense code switching than the ones in the UK who are first generation. So I think this is quite important because it tells us that the context creates a different type of code switch, and this may have repercussions for executive functions. So when we're talking about code switching, it's important to differentiate and know what do those participants do in terms of code switching, because the effects on executive function tasks may be different. So the second study is looking at bilingual education and executive functions. And this is a large study run by Yanthi Tsimpli at the University of Thessaloniki. And I'm part of the group, so she sent me some data to present. So the focus of the study is to find out if there are differences based on bilingual education and literacy. So we have a large data set of children across 5 different countries and many schools. And what we're looking at is whether the schooling, the education that they get, is whether there are more than one languages and what is the degree. So it's a continuous variable. We don't have bilingual versus monolingual. There are different degrees. So I'm going to illustrate that by showing you different contexts. So we have children who have Albanian as L1, Greek as L2, English as L1, Greek as L2, and then with German, some children have German as L1 and Greek as L2, and some the other way around. They go to different schools in different countries, and so we're looking at how much education do they have in the first language, how much in the second one. So we have context of submersion in which children are taught exclusively in the L2. So these are children who live in Greece. They go to Greek schools. They don't have any education in Albanian, no literacy, or just oral Albanian language. And then we have another group here. These are children who live in Albania. They go to a Greek-Albanian school. And this is more or less balanced. So they do half of the subjects in Greek, half of the subjects in Albania. So literacy is in both languages. And in the other contexts, there are variations of that. So we took the number of hours and subjects in the one language, in the other language, and we created a continuous variable. And we wanted to see, is there going to be any effects of the balanced or non-balanced education and literacy to executive functions. One of the tasks that we used was the end-back task, and I think that was discussed yesterday. So in the end-back task, you you see numbers, and then you have to press a button if you see the same number that you saw 2 back, or 3 back, or 1 back. So you start with 0, and then you increase in terms of how many trials you have to look back. So this is basically addressing updating and working memory. So as I mentioned, we used the NBAC score as the dependent variable, and then we used the education as a continuous variable, looking at whether there's going to be a relationship between the two. We did mixed models effects, and we were looking at bilingual education as a variable, as a predictor, but we also had country and school as random effects, because we wanted to make sure that it's not the school or the country that is contributing. And we did several models. When we had bilingual education, that was the first model. Then we added the Raven score, because we had Ravens as an additional task. That improved the model. An interaction between bilingual education and Ravens didn't really provide anything in addition. And we also wanted to control for the proficiency. So we had a vocabulary test for Greek, which was the language that all of the children had. And so by adding vocabulary, that didn't change or improve the model. So the second model seems to be the one which is the best one. So by looking at those factors, it looks as if there is a bilingual education score predicting the outcome on the NBAC and also the Raven score, but these are two independent factors. And here we've just split the group into the ones with unbalanced and the ones with balanced, and this is the score, the NBAC score, and you can see that there is a reliable difference on the NBAC comparing balanced and non-balanced. So with this we think that what it shows us is that if you have bilingual education and literacy in 2 languages, then you're training not only the oral, but also written language. Now, why would that have an effect, or why would that be associated with the NBAC? Well, maybe if we think about what we do when we do NBAC, we have to keep something in memory and update. This is similar to what we do when we read, because we read and we read words. We have to get to the meaning of words, but we have to combine the meaning of words together and then get to the larger picture. So we need to update when we read. So what's the way forward? I think it's very important, as I mentioned earlier, that we need to model the factors that contribute to noise. So we need to understand better all those environmental factors and the different types of bilingualism. We also need to scrutinize the task we use, increase their reliability, pin down what actually we are testing, and develop a comprehensive model or comprehensive models about the relationship between executive functions and language. I think we also need to be aware of ceiling effects. So when we're looking especially at young adults and the task may not be as taxing, then we may not find effects just because the task is too easy. I think we should leave politics aside and look for the evidence, and also leave the zeitgeist aside. And by the way, I think in terms of zeitgeist now we have bias for and bias that there is no effect. I think we also need to encourage a constructive debate and look at the evidence. So I'm sorry for putting capital letters and red, but I think that's very important. Now, if several studies, so I'm saying look at the evidence, if several studies are showing evidence of a null effect, I think this is inconclusive, so we still have to account for the studies that do show the evidence. Because by finding a null result, it doesn't mean that the ones who do find the results are wrong. And discrepancies between studies can be used to try to understand the relationship between executive functions and language, rather than say there is no relationship, so let's move on with something else. Thank you.